I never thought my own SUV would be taken from my driveway without my permission, but that morning, it was simply gone. No note, no call, just empty space where my car used to be, and a silence that felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my own home. By Monday morning, I was staring at a $3,100 towing bill while the police kept calling my phone, asking questions I could not even fully answer yet. And when I finally confronted my daughter-in-law, I didn't raise my voice. I simply realized something in my life had already shifted in a way I could not undo. If this story speaks to your heart, or even makes you feel something you can't quite explain, take a moment to like and subscribe. And I would truly love to know where you are watching from today, what city or country, and even the time where you are right now. Because somehow, stories like this feel different depending on where they are heard. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 67 years old. And what happened that weekend didn't just involve a car, it quietly changed the way I saw my own family. And if you stay with me until the end of this story, you might understand why silence sometimes becomes the most powerful response a person can have. But let me take you back to where everything began. It started on a quiet Saturday morning in Boulder, Colorado, where I had lived for almost 20 years in the same house, a house I once believed would always feel like home. I remember standing in my kitchen holding my coffee, watching the light hit my driveway, where my silver SUV sat parked exactly where I left it the night before. My son David had moved in with his wife Jessica Miller almost a year earlier, along with her parents, Ellen and Robert, who were just staying temporarily, or so I was told. That morning, Jessica walked into the kitchen with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Morning, Mom Collins. My parents would love to see the town today. Can we borrow your SUV for a few hours?" I paused for a second, the way you do when something doesn't sound like a real question, but more like an assumption dressed as politeness. "I didn't realize we had discussed that," I said calmly, setting my mug down. Jessica laughed lightly, waving her hand as if it didn't matter. "Oh, it'll be fine. We'll bring it back before dinner." Before I could respond, I saw Robert already standing by the front door, keys in hand as if the decision had already been made somewhere without me. I turned toward David, expecting at least a moment of hesitation, but he avoided my eyes. "It's just for a few hours, Mom," he said quietly, and that was it. Not a request anymore, not even a conversation. Just something that had already been decided over my own head. I remember Jessica adding, "Don't worry, we'll take good care of it," in a tone that sounded almost amused, like I was being overly cautious about something that wasn't really mine to worry about. Then I watched as they all walked out together, the sound of the SUV engine starting up echoing down the street, fading into the distance far too easily. I stood there longer than I should have, still holding my coffee, trying to convince myself that maybe I was overthinking it, that maybe this was just family adjusting to shared space. But something about the way no one had actually waited for my answer kept replaying in my mind. Hours passed, then the evening came, and the driveway stayed empty. No update, no message, no, "We're running late," just silence. And somewhere inside that silence, I began to feel something I couldn't yet name, as if a boundary I didn't know I had was already being crossed without permission. But what I didn't know then was that the SUV wasn't the only thing that had been taken that day, and the truth behind where it went would not come to light until Monday morning when my phone started ringing from numbers I didn't recognize. I used to believe that silence was just a part of who I was, something I was born with rather than something I learned. But the truth is, I grew up inside a house where speaking too loudly never changed anything. My childhood home in Ohio was small, always slightly too cold in the winter and too quiet in the summer, and my father had a way of making decisions feel final before anyone else had a chance to speak. My older brother, Thomas, always received the louder voice in the room, the easier explanations, and the quicker approval. I remember sitting at our old wooden kitchen table, watching my mother slide a plate of warm food toward him first, even when I was the one who had set the table. "He had a long day," she would say gently, as if my days were somehow easier by default. One evening when I was about 14, I finally asked, "What about me?" And my father looked up from his newspaper without much emotion and said, "You will be fine, Margaret. You always are." That was the sentence that taught me how not to ask twice. I learned to fold my disappointment quietly into routines. into homework, into the way I cleaned the same counter twice, just to feel something was mine to control. Even small things carried meaning back then, like the blue ribbon I earned in a school writing contest that was placed on the fridge for exactly 2 days before it disappeared behind grocery lists and reminders for Thomas's football schedule. "Where did my ribbon go?" I asked my mother once, and she replied without looking up. "We needed space for important things." Thomas later shrugged and said, "It is just paper, Margaret." I stopped asking after that. Years passed, and I built a life that looked steady from the outside. Marriage, a son, a house in Boulder, Colorado with wide windows, and a driveway I kept clean, like it was a habit inherited from control rather than comfort. Even when my husband passed years ago, I stayed in that rhythm of maintaining what was left, believing that if I kept things orderly, nothing unexpected would break through again. But what I did not realize was that patterns do not disappear just because time moves forward. They only change shape and find new people to repeat themselves through. When David brought Jessica into my home, I noticed small echoes of that old dynamic almost immediately. The way decisions were assumed rather than discussed. The way my presence in conversations became optional instead of essential. "It will be fine, Mom," David would say sometimes. The same tone my father once used, and I would feel something familiar tighten quietly in my chest. I never said anything at first, not because I agreed, but because I had learned long ago that speaking does not always mean being heard. And as I stood in my kitchen that weekend, watching another generation move through my space as if it adapted itself around them, I began to understand something I had spent decades avoiding. The story of my life was not just about what happened to me, but about how easily I allowed it to continue without interruption, and that realization was the first small crack in a much larger truth I was not yet ready to face. I did not realize it at the time, but the day everything began to shift was not the day the SUV disappeared, nor even the day I felt ignored in my own home. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when something inside me refused to react the way it always had. I was standing in my kitchen in Boulder, Colorado, holding my second cup of coffee, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and instead of ignoring it like I usually did, I answered. "Mrs. Collins, this is the Boulder Community Arts Council," the voice said politely. "We received your submission for the local senior storytelling showcase, and we would like to invite you to present next month." For a moment, I did not speak, not because I was unsure, but because no one had called me for something like this in years. Jessica walked into the kitchen just as I was saying, "Yes, I understand. I will attend," and she paused, tilting her head slightly. "Attend what?" she asked, opening the refrigerator without waiting for an answer. I closed my phone slowly and said, "A community presentation." David looked up from his tablet at the dining table and smiled faintly. "That is great, Mom," he said. "You will do fine." Jessica gave a small laugh, not unkind but sharp, in a way that made the air feel thinner. "Oh, that is cute," she said, pouring herself coffee. "I did not know you were into that kind of thing." And for the first time in a long time, I did not respond the way I used to. Normally, I would have smiled, nodded, and let the moment pass like so many others before it. But instead, I simply said, "It is something I chose to do." And I turned back toward the sink without explaining further. The silence that followed felt different, heavier, like it was being measured. That same afternoon, I went into my home office and started preparing materials for the presentation, pulling out old photographs, writing notes in a steady hand I had not used for anything meaningful in years. And I noticed something unexpected inside myself, a sense of clarity I had not felt since before my husband passed. Later that evening, Jessica stood in the hallway watching me sort through papers and said, "You are really serious about this?" And I replied without looking up, "Yes, I am." She did not like that answer. I could feel it in the way she shifted her weight and sighed. "Well, just do not let it take over the house," she said, as if my life had to be scheduled around the comfort of others. David, passing behind her, added quietly, "Let her do it, Jess." It was the first time I heard him say something that did not immediately bend toward agreement, and I noticed Jessica glance at him with a look that lingered a second too long. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I sat alone at the kitchen table and realized something simple but unsettling. I had not asked for permission once that day. Not for the call, not for the decision, not for the work I was doing, and yet nothing had fallen apart because of it. It was a small realization, but it stayed with me longer than expected. The next morning, I went outside and checked my driveway, expecting the same quiet routine, but there was a subtle tension in the air, like something had already been decided without being spoken aloud. And as I stood there looking at the empty space beside my house, I could not shake the feeling that whatever change had started inside me was about to meet something far more complicated coming from the people I called family. I did not understand how quickly a simple misunderstanding could turn into something that felt like the truth to everyone except me. But that is exactly what began to happen in the days that followed. It started with a phone call I did not expect. David standing in the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, his expression already tense before he even spoke to me. "Mom," he said carefully, "Jessica says you agreed to let them take the SUV for the weekend." I paused, still holding a dish towel, thinking I had misheard him. "I did not agree to that," I replied calmly, placing the towel down on the counter. Jessica appeared behind him almost immediately, her voice soft but confident, like she had already rehearsed the moment. "Margaret, I thought you said yes when we were in the kitchen," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You even smiled." I felt something inside me go still. Not angry, not loud, just still in a way that made everything sharper. "I did not say yes," I answered, my voice steady. David looked between us, uncertain, and that uncertainty was exactly where everything started to slip away from my control. Later that day, I overheard Jessica on the phone in the living room, her tone light, almost casual. "Yes, she was fine with it," she said, laughing softly. "She probably just forgot." I stood in the hallway listening, not interrupting, because I needed to understand how far this had gone. The next morning, Robert, Jessica's father, mentioned it at breakfast as if it were already established fact. "That SUV is really nice for long drives," he said, cutting his toast. "Your mother-in-law was kind enough to let us use it." I noticed David did not correct him. Instead, he nodded slightly, like he was trying to avoid conflict rather than clarify truth. That was the first moment I realized the story was no longer just being misunderstood. It was being rewritten. By the afternoon, I received another call from the towing company asking for confirmation on pickup authorization, and when I said I had not authorized anything, the woman on the line hesitated. "Ma'am," she said politely, "our records show a family approval on file." My hand tightened around the phone. "That is not accurate," I said slowly. "I did not approve anything." There was a pause, the kind that feels heavier than words, and then she simply said they would review the file. When I hung up, I stood in my kitchen longer than I intended, staring at the driveway through the window, waiting for something to make sense again. But nothing did. That evening, Jessica walked past me and said quietly, almost kindly, "You are making this harder than it needs to be." And for the first time, I did not respond at all. I simply watched her continue walking as if nothing had shifted. And then, just before midnight, my phone lit up again, with a message from an unknown number containing a single line that changed everything I thought I knew about what had happened to my SUV, and I felt the ground beneath the entire story begin to break open. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because I was trying to understand how something so simple could unravel so completely without anyone noticing except me. By morning, my phone was already filled with messages that I had not seen before, each one more distant than the last, as if I had suddenly become a problem they were all trying to solve instead of a person they knew. The first was from David. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk about the SUV situation. Jessica is very upset." There was no apology, no clarification, only the word situation, as if my missing vehicle had become an abstract inconvenience rather than something that belonged to me. Then came Jessica's message, sent minutes later. "I think you are misunderstanding everything. We are trying to fix this, but you are not cooperating." I read it twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I was trying to find where in those words my reality had been replaced by someone else's version of it. I replied simply, "There is nothing to fix on my side," and I did not receive a response. That morning, I went to the kitchen and found Robert sitting at the table with a printed paper in front of him, tapping it lightly with his finger. "This came from the towing company," he said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. They said everything was authorized by family consent. I looked at the paper and saw my name listed in a section I had never signed. My voice stayed even when I said, "That is not my signature." Robert shrugged slightly. "Not unkind, but indifferent. It is already processed," he said. "These things happen in families sometimes." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else that morning. Later, I called the towing company myself. The woman who answered sounded rehearsed, polite, distant. "Ma'am, we have documentation indicating authorization was provided through household access verification," she said. I asked to see it. There was a pause before she replied. "We are not able to release internal verification records directly, but your family representative confirmed it." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of a system that had already decided what was true without asking me. I then called David again. He picked up after the third attempt. "Mom, why are you doing this?" he said immediately. "We are trying to handle it." "Handle what?" I asked quietly. "Something I never agreed to?" There was a long silence. Then Jessica's voice in the background, sharp and controlled. "This is becoming unnecessary," she said, taking the phone. "You are making everyone uncomfortable." I closed my eyes for a moment and said, "I am asking for clarity, not conflict." She did not respond to that. Instead, she ended the call. That afternoon, I checked my email and found a message titled, "Family Resolution Summary," outlining a version of events I had never been part of, describing agreements I had never given, and decisions I had never witnessed. Attached were timestamps, notes, and confirmations that felt precise enough to be believable to anyone who had not been there. I printed it out and placed it on the counter beside the kitchen sink, staring at it longer than I expected. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt like silence. It felt like distance had moved inside the walls themselves. No one called again that day. No one knocked. No one corrected anything. And as the evening light faded through the windows of my Boulder home, I realized something I had not fully admitted until that moment. I was no longer part of the conversation about my own life, and the silence that followed was not peace, but a kind of emotional isolation I was only beginning to understand. I remember the exact moment I stopped feeling like I was simply being misunderstood and started realizing I was being erased from the narrative entirely. It was not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Boulder, Colorado, when I opened the mailbox and found a sympathy card addressed to the Collins family, signed by neighbors I had spoken to for years. I stood there holding it longer than I should have, because no one had told me anything had happened that required sympathy. When I walked back inside, David was in the living room on a video call, his voice low and careful. "Yes, she is doing okay," he said, then paused. "She just needs time to process everything." I stopped in the hallway. When the call ended, I asked him, "Process what exactly?" He looked uncomfortable, rubbing his hand across his forehead. "Mom, it is just how Jessica explained it to the neighbors. It is easier this way." That sentence landed heavier than anything before it, because it confirmed something I had only suspected. The version of my life being shared with others no longer matched my own. Jessica walked in later that evening, carrying grocery bags, acting as if nothing had shifted. "You should not take things so personally," she said casually, placing items on the counter. "People just want clarity," I replied quietly. "Clarity is not the same as replacement." She did not answer, just closed the fridge a little harder than necessary. The next morning, I received another call, this time from the hospital in Boulder, asking if I could confirm family authorization for a routine check on a relative I did not even know was listed under my contact information. My hand shook slightly as I said, "There is no authorization from me." The nurse hesitated before replying. "We have you listed as emergency contact for Mr. Robert Miller." I sat down immediately. Robert, Jessica's father. I had never agreed to that. I had never even been asked. Later that day, I confronted David in the kitchen. "Why am I listed on documents I never signed?" I asked. He avoided my eyes again. "Jessica probably added it when she was organizing paperwork," he said softly. "It is not a big deal, Mom, but it was becoming a pattern, not of single mistakes, but of decisions made about me without me." That evening, I learned something else. The SUV incident had been escalated beyond my awareness, and insurance records were now referencing claims I had never submitted. I sat alone at the kitchen table that night, the house quiet in a way that no longer felt peaceful, only empty. I looked at my phone, at the unanswered messages, at the documents printed and stacked beside me, and I realized something I had been resisting for weeks. I was no longer part of the decision-making layer of my own life. I was only being informed after the fact, if at all. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but stopped halfway through dialing because I could not think of a single person who still had the full picture of what was happening. The loneliness was not just emotional anymore. It was structural, built into every interaction around me. And in that stillness, I felt something shift, not anger, not panic, but awareness, a clear and quiet recognition that I could not remain in this position forever. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was waiting for things to change on their own. I did not expect change to feel this ordinary at first. It did not arrive with a breakthrough or a dramatic decision, but with small, consistent actions I started taking without telling anyone in the house. I woke up earlier each morning, not to accommodate anyone else, but to sit at the kitchen table in silence with my notebook open. I began writing again. Not stories yet, just fragments of memory, observations, sentences that felt like they belonged to me alone. One morning, I wrote, "I am still here, even when I am not acknowledged," and I stared at that line longer than I expected. I stopped waiting for permission to use my own time. When David passed through the kitchen one morning and said, "Mom, we might need you to be home for the plumber," I replied calmly without looking up. I already scheduled my day. It was a simple sentence, but the pause that followed told me more than any conversation could. Jessica later leaned against the counter and asked, "Are you getting involved in something?" And I answered, "Yes, I am rebuilding my routine." She studied me for a moment, then said lightly, "That sounds serious for someone retired." I did not explain. I did not defend. I simply continued writing. A few days later, I attended my first meeting at a local community storytelling workshop in Boulder, Colorado. The room was small, filled with people who looked like they had also been carrying quiet histories for a long time. When I introduced myself, I said, "My name is Margaret Collins. I am 67 years old, and I am learning how to tell my own story again." A woman across the room smiled and said, "That is the hardest kind." After the session, one of the organizers approached me and said, "We think your voice would fit well in our upcoming public showcase, if you are interested." I remember nodding slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I was realizing how long it had been since someone had offered me something based on my voice rather than my obligation. When I returned home that evening, I found David in the kitchen looking at mail on the counter. "You were out late," he said. I replied, "I was working on something that matters to me." He did not respond immediately, and Jessica entered shortly after, glancing at me with a brief expression I could not fully read. "You seem different lately," she said. I answered honestly, "I am starting to pay attention to things I ignored before." That night, I received an email confirming my selection for the showcase presentation, and I sat at the kitchen table longer than usual, reading it twice, not because I doubted it, but because it felt like evidence that I still had a place outside of this house. The next morning, I made a list of tasks for myself, not for anyone else, and for the first time in a long time, I did not cross anything out for approval. I noticed small shifts in how I carried myself, how I answered questions, how I held silence without filling it. Even the air in the house felt slightly different, as if it had not yet adjusted to the fact that I was no longer moving through it in the same way. And as I stood at the front door that afternoon, holding my bag and looking toward the driveway, I understood something quietly powerful was forming ahead of me, something that would not stay contained within these walls much longer. I remember the first time I walked into the community storytelling center as someone who was still unsure whether I belonged there. But everything changed slowly, not suddenly, as if my life had decided to rebuild itself one quiet decision at a time. It was a crisp morning in Boulder, Colorado when I was handed a laminated badge at the front desk. "Presenter," it said in clean black letters, with my name printed beneath it, Margaret Collins. I stood there staring at it for a moment longer than necessary, because I had not worn anything that identified me by purpose in years. The coordinator smiled and said, "We are glad you are here, Margaret. Your story matters." I nodded, not trusting my voice at first, then replied softly, "I am still learning to believe that." Inside the room, I noticed the way people turned slightly when I spoke, not out of obligation, but attention. After my presentation rehearsal, a woman from the organizing committee approached me and said, "We have been discussing expanding your role beyond just the showcase. There is an opening for a senior community liaison position if you are interested." I remember blinking slowly before asking, "What would that involve?" She explained calmly. "You would help guide other presenters, coordinate sessions, and represent the program in local outreach events." It was not just an invitation. It was recognition of something I had stopped expecting. That evening, I returned home and placed the badge on the kitchen counter, where it caught the light in a way that made it feel almost unfamiliar inside my own house. David noticed it first. "What is that?" he asked, picking it up. I answered, "It is a position badge for the storytelling program." Jessica looked over from the sink and said lightly, "So this is becoming serious for you." I met her gaze and replied, "It already is." The difference in my tone was small, but I saw her expression shift for a brief second, as if she was recalculating something. Over the next week, I started attending meetings regularly, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late afternoon, always returning with notes, schedules, and a growing sense of structure that did not depend on approval from anyone at home. One day, I was given an official staff folder with my full title printed inside, Community Program Liaison, Boulder Cultural Initiative. Holding it in my hands, I felt something steady settle inside me, not pride in the way I used to understand it, but alignment. At home, conversations began to change shape around my absence rather than my presence. "You are out again?" David asked one evening. "Yes," I replied calmly. "I have responsibilities." Jessica leaned against the doorway and said, "It seems like you are building a whole separate life." I looked up briefly and answered, "I am building something I should have paid attention to earlier." The room went quiet after that, not tense but uncertain. A few days later, I was invited to speak at a regional planning meeting downtown, and I remember adjusting my simple blazer, looking at my reflection, noticing how natural it felt to stand taller without effort. When I arrived, a program director greeted me and said, "Margaret Collins, we have heard a lot about your perspective. We are glad you are part of this initiative." During the meeting, I was introduced as part of the leadership panel, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like someone adapting to a space, but someone already expected to be there. When I returned home that night, I placed my keys in the same bowl by the kitchen door, but this time the house felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. And as I stood there listening to the quiet hum of the house around me, I realized I was no longer the person waiting to be included in her own life. I was already moving through it on my own terms, unaware that this new position I had just stepped into would soon intersect with everything that had been left unresolved in the past. I arrived at the hospital in Boulder just before noon, but it felt like I had stepped into a different version of time, one where every second moved slower than it should. The parking lot was half full, the air sharp with early autumn cold, and I remember holding my bag tighter than usual as I walked toward the entrance. David had texted me earlier, "Please come as soon as you can. It is important." No explanation, no context, only urgency. Inside, the fluorescent lights were too bright, too clean, too indifferent to anything human happening beneath them. A nurse at the front desk looked up as I approached. "Margaret Collins?" she asked. I nodded. "They are waiting for you in consultation room 3, she said politely, but there was something in her tone that made my stomach tighten slightly. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed David standing near the door, his posture stiff, his hands clasped together in front of him like he was trying to hold himself in place. Jessica was beside him, unusually quiet, her eyes fixed on the floor rather than meeting mine. "Mom," David said when he saw me, his voice lower than usual. "Thank you for coming." I looked between them and asked calmly, "What is going on?" Jessica finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "We need to clarify some things about the documents," she said, glancing briefly at David, as if confirming agreement. I stepped closer. "What documents?" David exhaled slowly. "It is about the SUV situation," he said. "The insurance company and the towing records. There are inconsistencies. I felt a familiar pressure in my chest. Not panic, but recognition that something had already been arranged before my arrival. Inconsistencies according to whom? I asked. Jessica answered quickly this time. According to the report we received this morning, there was a pause, and I noticed a man in a suit standing further down the hallway holding a folder, watching us with professional detachment. David lowered his voice. They asked all of us to come in because there are questions about authorization signatures. I looked at him directly. All of us? I repeated. He hesitated. Yes, he said quietly, including Robert. That was the first time I felt the situation shift in a way I could not immediately interpret. Jessica stepped slightly closer to David and said, "It is just a formality, Margaret. Nothing serious if everything is correct." I replied, "Then everything should be very simple." The man in the suit approached us at that moment, opening his folder. "Mrs. Collins," he said formally, "we have completed a preliminary review of the authorization documents submitted in your name." I could feel David tense beside me. Jessica remained still, but her expression tightened slightly. The man continued, "Before we proceed further, we need to confirm one final detail regarding the timeline of consent." I asked evenly, "What timeline?" He looked down at the page in front of him, and for a brief moment, the entire hallway seemed to narrow around the words he was about to speak. "The timestamp indicates authorization was recorded prior to the date you stated you were present at your residence," he said. I did not respond immediately. David turned toward me slowly, as if trying to read my reaction before anyone else could. Jessica's hand moved slightly toward her phone, then stopped. The man adjusted his grip on the folder. "If this is not accurate," he added, "we will need clarification from all parties involved before moving forward." And in that moment, standing under the sterile light of the hospital hallway, I realized I was about to hear a version of events that had already been prepared without me, one that would either confirm everything I had suspected or change everything I thought I knew. And the next words spoken would decide which truth would finally come to the surface. I stood still in the hospital hallway as the man in the suit lowered his folder slightly, and for the first time, the air around us felt like it had stopped moving. No one spoke immediately, not because there was confusion, but because something had reached its final shape and needed no more explanation. David shifted his weight, his eyes no longer meeting mine the way they used to. Jessica's posture changed too, not dramatic, but precise, like she was realizing that control had a limit she had not accounted for. The man cleared his throat once, then said in an even voice, "We have completed cross-verification of the authorization timeline with the digital registry and the towing company logs." He turned the page. "There is a discrepancy that cannot be reconciled with the submitted family consent statement." David exhaled quietly, almost inaudibly. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. The man answered without emotion. "It means the authorization attributed to Mrs. Collins does not align with her recorded location or activity at the time it was submitted." Jessica finally spoke, her voice steady but lower than before. "There must be a mistake in the system." The man shook his head slightly. Multiple systems confirmed the same timestamp pattern. That sentence landed differently. It was not an accusation. It was confirmation. I looked at David and said calmly, "I never signed anything, and I never agreed to anything being done in my name." He did not respond immediately, and that silence told me more than words could. Jessica turned toward me, her expression carefully controlled. "Margaret, this is being taken out of context," she said. I met her eyes and replied, "No. It is finally being placed in context." The man in the suit closed the folder halfway, signaling the shift in direction. "At this point," he said, "we will be documenting misrepresentation in the authorization process and notifying the relevant parties for formal review." There was no raised voice, no confrontation, only procedure unfolding in real time. David looked at the floor, then back at me, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "Mom, I did not understand what was happening," he said. I nodded once. "Understanding comes after attention," I replied. Jessica took a small step back, her hands still, her breathing measured, as if she was recalibrating the version of reality she had been operating in. The man added, "Mrs. Collins, you are no longer listed as passive contact in any of the associated records moving forward. unless you choose otherwise. That was the moment I felt the shift complete, not as victory, but as clarity finally settling into place. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply said, "That is correct." David looked at me again, this time differently, not as someone trying to explain, but as someone trying to understand who I had become while he was not looking. Jessica said nothing after that, only glanced away briefly, as if searching for an argument that no longer fit the situation. The man in the suit prepared to leave, offering a final professional nod before stepping back into the corridor. And as he walked away, the silence that remained between the three of us was no longer filled with confusion or denial, but with the sudden realization that the version of events they had been holding on to had already ended, and standing in its place was a truth none of them had fully prepared to face. I did not leave the hospital the same person who had walked in. Nothing around me had physically changed, but the weight of what had just been confirmed followed me through every step as I walked back through the corridor. David and Jessica were still standing near the consultation area when I turned back, but the dynamic between us had shifted into something quieter, more fragile, like a structure that had been rebuilt incorrectly and could no longer hide its flaws. David spoke first, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "Mom, I did not realize it had gone this far." I looked at him and replied calmly, "That is exactly the problem." Not realizing, Jessica folded her arms, but her confidence had thinned. "This is being handled legally now, so there is nothing more to discuss," she said. I nodded slightly. "Then let it be handled correctly," I answered. There was no anger in my tone, only finality. That difference alone seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have. As we stepped outside into the cold air of the parking lot, David tried again. "We can still fix this between us," he said quietly. I stopped walking and turned toward him. "Between us," I repeated slowly, "would have required you to include me before decisions were made in my name." He did not respond. Jessica looked away, adjusting her bag strap, no longer speaking at all. The silence between us was no longer uncertain. It was defined. Later that evening at home, I sat at the kitchen table while David attempted one last conversation. "Mom, I know mistakes were made," he said, "but we are still family." I placed my hands together gently on the table and answered, "Family does not remove a person from their own decisions and call it misunderstanding." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else that night. Jessica remained in the doorway, listening but not interrupting. After a long pause, she said softly, "We did not think it would be interpreted this way." I looked at her and replied, "That is because you were not the one removed from the interpretation." She had no response. The next morning, I received a formal notification from the administrative office, confirming that all prior records involving my authorization had been amended and corrected based on verified documentation. The email was neutral, procedural, but its effect was absolute. It meant the system had now officially aligned with what I had been saying all along. David read the email over my shoulder in silence. "So it is really done," he said quietly. I answered, "It is corrected." Jessica stood at the kitchen counter, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she said, "What happens now?" I paused before replying, not out of uncertainty, but clarity. "Now," I said calmly, "boundaries are no longer negotiable." That was the first time neither of them attempted to challenge what I said. Still, the room did not feel resolved. It felt suspended, like something important had been acknowledged but not yet accepted. David finally spoke again, softer this time. "I do not know how to move forward with this," he admitted. I looked at him and said, "Then start by learning what was missing before it reached this point." No one responded after that, and as I stood up and walked toward the hallway, I understood that while the formal truth had been recognized, the emotional truth was still unsettled, and what came next would determine whether anything in this family could ever return to balance again. I am sitting at my kitchen table in Boulder, Colorado, the same table where everything once felt uncertain, but now feels grounded in a way I did not think was possible a few months ago. The morning light comes through the window in a slower, softer way, and there is a quietness in the house that no longer feels like absence, but like space I finally own. David visits less often now, but when he does, he no longer speaks in assumptions. Jessica remains polite, distant, careful with her words. as if she has learned that language itself carries consequences. There is no dramatic reconciliation, no perfect repair, only distance shaped into something more honest than before. I still attend the community center in Boulder, but now I do it with a different rhythm, not as someone seeking permission to exist, but as someone guiding others who are still finding their voice. One afternoon after a session, a young woman approached me quietly and said, "I do not know how to set boundaries without feeling guilty." I looked at her for a moment and replied, "Guilt is not always a signal that you are wrong. Sometimes it is the echo of a pattern that no longer fits you." She nodded slowly, and I recognized myself in her uncertainty. That is when I understood the real shape of healing. It is not loud. It is not immediate. It is consistent decisions made in silence when no one is watching. I began to understand that trust is not something you extend endlessly. It is something you place carefully where it is returned with respect. And intuition, that quiet voice I once ignored, had never been absent, only unheard. If you are listening to this and you feel like you have been explaining yourself too often, shrinking your truth so others can feel comfortable, I want you to know something simple. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to choose clarity over confusion, even if it disappoints people who benefited from your silence. There is a kind of peace that does not come from agreement, but from alignment with yourself, and it is quieter than people expect, but infinitely stronger. I do not see my past as something I escaped anymore, but as something that taught me where my limits needed to be drawn. If there is one thing I would leave you with, it is this. You do not lose love by setting boundaries. You lose confusion. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 67 years old, and the most important lesson I want to share with you is that your worth does not increase when you are understood. It exists even when you are not. And if this story reached you in some quiet corner of your life, thank you for staying with me through it. Thank you for listening without judgment. And if you feel comfortable, share where you are watching from and what time it is in your world right now, because it reminds all of us that we are never truly alone in what we carry. If this message resonated with you, you can subscribe or leave a comment, not as obligation, but as connection. And if you need more stories like this, there are others waiting for you here, each one a reminder that even after silence, there is always a way back to yourself.